do it. It's go time.
Hello and welcome to Go Time. Today we are going to be talking to tech lawyer Louis Villa, who returns to Go Time to school us once again on the intellectual property concerns of software creation in the crazy days we live in. This time around, however, we're going to be focusing on the implications of large language models, code generation, and where this leaves us on the question of who owns our code. And on that note, I would like to introduce you to Louis, who is a programmer turned attorney. He's been involved in open source since college. He's worked at Mozilla, where he revised the Mozilla public license, at Wikimedia Foundation, where he briefly led the community team. He's been a lawyer for Google, Amazon, and many small startups. And currently, he's the co-founder of Tidelift, which works to make open source better for everyone by paying maintainers. What a concept. Welcome to the podcast once again. Lovely to have you.
I'm glad to be back.
And we're happy to have you. Round two. As always, our conversation got far too interesting the first time around, so we had to do another one.
Well, and it's all feels so new. It's funny. I mean, I think we knew this. When did we record the last one? Like October?
Yeah.
And I gave a talk in early November, and I was looking at those slides in December. I gave a talk on machine learning and IP and open source in November, and I looked at the slides in December, and to my surprise, they were not embarrassing because, it feels like the pace of change right now is so much that like even in a month, things can get out of date. And so I was pleased that those are mildly mistaken now. So.
Excited to dive even deeper and hear about all the new thoughts that might have come on and the things that stay the same. To help us along in our little chit chat, got two people who are never getting out of date, never going to get old. We have the one
never going to give you up.
Yeah, never going to give you. Don't get me started. Kris, happy 2023.
Hello, happy New Year.
Happy New Year. How are you?
I'm doing excellent. It's a new year. We get to make all these resolutions and whatnot, hoping to change our lives. I made some good resolutions for myself. Although I do like small habit changes. I don't do resolutions. Okay. Resolutions are like too big. It's like, I'll go to the gym every day. It's like, no. Work out more. Like just try and slightly improve things and just do that continuously.
Yeah, leave it open to interpretation. Go to the gym more. I never went to the gym, so going once this year it counts.
Yeah. It's also good to like if one of your resolutions is to go to the gym, start in like February. So then the gym is more empty because everybody that started their resolutions in January is like, I can't do this anymore, and then leaves.
January kick.
Yeah, then you have all the equipment and everything. It's good.
Very, very excited to chit chat and hear all the both meta and direct thoughts and feelings you may have. I'm excited. Hi, Natalie.
Hi, Angelica.
As always, we're here again.
Yet another conversation.
Conversation. How are you?
Great. Yes, celebrating all the New Years. There's one more New Year to start this year, right? The Hebrew New Year already happened. The Georgian New Year, like the regular New Year, Gregorian. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Thank you. The Orthodox New Year. So just the Chinese New Year is coming up, and we're good.
Awesome. Well, excited to have this conversation. As I mentioned in our intro, we're going to be focusing more on kind of ML, AI, etc. But before we dive in there, I'm going to be a little bit cheeky. And for those who haven't listened to our first round of this part one, I'm going to ask you, Louis, whether you can give us a TLDR, and I know that's an ask, of generally how do we think about code ownership, just to kind of set us up as we go into this deeper dive conversation.
The TLDR for copyright ownership of code is the same as it is with every piece of music, every piece of art, every piece of poetry. If a human writes it down, it's copyrighted. But of course, you see already where we're going with that, which is the if a human part. And that's where this all gets very complicated very fast. right? Because the basics of, you don't have to, sort of common mythologies around intellectual property, right? I need to put all rights reserved. I need to put the years. There was a big curl, the popular, get things from the internet program, recently did a big commit a couple days ago, removing all of the years from the headers of all of it, because somebody finally convinced the author, like, actually, because he had done a commit saying like, oh yeah, well, we're going to add 2023, and somebody's like, you don't actually have to do that, and he's like, really? I've been wasting my time all these 20 some years that he's been maintaining curl, updating those every year. And a few on Twitter and Mastodon, a few people chimed in saying like, no, really, you don't have to do it. And he was like, okay, great, bonk, gone. But there are these sort of kinds of mythologies built up. But like the bottom line is really like, if you as a human being exercising some kind of, in the US in particular, exercising some kind of creativity, if you're writing down a phone book, you don't get copyright on that. And again, the exercising creativity part is going to come in. Then you have ownership of your code. The one other thing that's relevant in this context is, of course, that our employers often can contract that right away from us. Right. So when we sign our employment contracts, there's a clause in there that essentially says, yeah, you're going to write a bunch of copyrightable stuff, and your employers are going to own that. And so, there's some nuance there, but like that's the general gist of it, is that if you're writing for an employer, that employer is going to own that stuff. And so then we come to this question of, okay, well, what happens if a machine writes it, right? But before I want to talk about that, I want to tell like my favorite funny story, which is very relevant. So at Wikipedia, there was one of the big Wikipedia legal team does is it defends people who edit Wikipedia against legal claims. And so, that can be like very dramatic stuff, like a politician is suing because they think their biography is slander or libelous, or it can be very silly things like a monkey took a selfie, and somebody uploaded that selfie to Wikipedia. And there's this it ended up being in some ways a sort of sad story, but the person who owned the camera, who's a nature and wildlife photographer, told us that he owned the copyright, told Wikipedia that he owned the copyright in the photo. And long story short, the Wikipedia legal department believed that this takedown request was not quite right, wasn't done with the proper formalities, and that also his original story was that the animal had taken the selfie, and as I said, a human, and this is where it ties into the machine learning part of things, a human has to take the picture. And so there was a whole big drawn out drama, threats of litigation over this question of, well, okay, did the monkey take the picture? And eventually the US Copyright Office sort of, in just sort of a footnote kind of way, weighed in and was like, we're pretty sure monkeys cannot take. If a monkey takes a selfie, no copyright, right? There wasn't a human involved in that loop. And so here we're coming back to and that was this sort of abstract thing, because it turns out there is a category on Wikipedia of art created by animals, which is fairly small, but includes like paintings done by elephants, a few other, there's some sheep selfies in there, if I recall correctly. And that gets us to this question though of like, okay, well, when we use machine learning to create code, to create, as we've all seen over the past few months, really interesting works of imagery, is that more like the monkey? Is that more, what happens to the humans who are in that loop, to the computers who are in that loop, to the data that's in that loop? And it suddenly gets very complicated very fast. And I think in part of the challenge is that honestly, attorneys can understand the monkey stole the camera and pointed the say. As soon as you start talking to them about like, well, here's how we trained the model, like eyes start to glaze over and it gets very complicated very fast. So I don't know, is that where we start today? Do we want to talk about, like, how much are you assuming that you're, like, every technologist has wanted to dig into machine learning? I don't know, how much of you three had time to do that?
Not as much as I want to. I guess I've generally been not like anti AI person, but I've always just been like, it's just fancy statistics. And so it's like one of those, like, I've on my long list of things to learn, like I have stats and I'm like, well, should just learn stats before I learn fancy stats. So I know enough that I can like generally describe what the things are doing, but not enough to like go implement something or like read some code that's doing it. Like I'm like, I don't know what any of that says, but like the concepts, I'm like, okay, I grok these concepts, I understand these concepts.
And kind of along those lines, in the interest of kind of setting up everyone to kind of have the same baseline understanding, when we're talking about like AI machine learning, at the basic concept level, what are we talking about here?
I have the answer from ChatGPT for this.
I'm ready.
So it's AI is a field of computer science that involves creating intelligent machines that can perform tasks that require human intelligence. And if you ask what is ML, that is a subset or part of AI where machines do things not because you program them to do that, but because they have enough data to take a decision to do something.
Okay. One mentions a level of curation and one mentions data. So in fact, should we be talking about these as very separate? In the legal field, maybe this is, or even Kris, like AI, as you described it there, had a level of, it began, I can't remember the exact sentence, maybe Natalie can, with like someone has implemented this from a individual, and machine learning references giving it data and it does its thing, which maybe is less human involvement.
I looked this up the other day. I find that definition of AI and ML interesting because the like hot minute of research I did on AI and ML, because I was like, what is the difference between these two things? And the answer I kind of came back with is like AI is, as you said, this general type of like, we want computers to be intelligent. And ML is a way of making computers intelligent, right? ML implements the AI interface for us nerds who write code. So that's the general way that I've come to see and think about it. So these are like two things that you kind of have to like talk about more or less together. Because like AI, it's like a little bit too abstract if you like you don't have anything else like behind it really.
AI is just a very general one. So in addition to ML is part of AI, but also things like computer vision is equivalent to ML and is under AI.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as somebody said, I was trying to explain that my sister has a master's in. Now that I think about it, I don't know if it's in AI or ML, but our father, who is not in computers at all, asked like, well, what's the difference between all these, and what's the difference between those things and an algorithm? And what we told him was that an algorithm is something that's actually implemented, and an ML is something that, you know, hasn't yet actually been implemented. This was a few years ago, and now, of course, that feels like it's changed a little bit. I mean, Kris, this gets to your point about like it's all just fancy stats, right? I feel like in some ways, machine learning, when we use that, is the variation of this that is really fancy stats versus like we programmed the thing to learn from its environment or something, right?
I kind of feel like it's similar to like if you ask the question of what's the difference between a CPU and a GPU, it's like basically like the type of math they're doing. Like they're both just adding numbers, but they just add numbers in like slightly different ways. And I feel like that's what like all of this stuff is. It's like, what's the difference between like traditional statistics or like Bayesian statistics and AI? And it's like, okay, well, it's like different flavors of those same underlying things.
Right. Well, and this is where it's actually been very interesting, but also frustrating to talk about this with attorneys, right? Because attorneys would really, as a general matter, like to come in when things are a little better defined. And when the programmers are still like sort of quibbling about definitions and struggling with definitions, that makes our job as attorneys much more difficult, right? Because we often lack the technical chops, and even if we do have the technical abilities, trying to get precise about this in language is a large part of what we do. And so if y'all can't get precise about the language, then we are, we're up the creek, right? We're in trouble. And so, I find it helpful, and I think probably helpful for somebody to make a distinction into sort of 3 phases, right? So the first one is data gathering and training, right? So we're getting a lot of data usually from the internet. It could be from, there's a lot of these things for medical fields now, but you're getting a lot of data. And Kris, again, to your point, you are learning the statistical patterns in that data. And that to me is where the learning part comes in, is that you are setting some software to analyze, find, learn the patterns in that data. So, that's often called training, right? But learning would be a similarly appropriate term, I think. You then, okay, so what's the output of that training? The output of that training is the statistical model, right? It is literally the pile of numbers that constitute our statistical knowledge about these things, right? It's a, n-dimensional graph of weights and blanking on the other term right now, but at the end of the day, it is numbers. And which, by the way, maybe we'll get into it later, maybe not, but copyright law tends to struggle with numbers, right? We tend to sort of assume that numbers are not creative, not protectable. They don't look like the things. Our intuitions as attorneys and as the people who wrote the statute and as the people who've been arguing about this for 100 years, right? Because we've been arguing about copyright in legal systems, in like modern legal systems for, depending on how you want to count, 300, 150 years. Pretty much all of that was about poetry, books, biography, music. So there's not much, like, we often argue about these things by analogy. And as you can guess, and as I think maybe we talked about in the last episode, the analogies are terrible. They're not very useful. And in part in this area, one of the things that's not useful is that what you've actually got is this pile of numbers, right? So you've got the training, you've got data, and and training is, by the way, an active thing, right? And then you've got the model, the output of the training, and then you've got, then you use that model to create outputs. And so each of those 3 are sort of different from an intellectual property perspective, right? So you can't really say, a lot of people have said this on the internet, but it grates every time I see it, something like machine learning is fair use, or machine learning is a copyright violation, right? Like, that's a category error. You can't say machine learning as a whole is a copyright problem. You have to say the training is a copyright problem, or the model is a copyright problem, or the outputs are a copyright problem, because each of those are potentially very different. So let's try to go through them real quick, right? So training, what kind of intellectual property rights are involved? You're taking a bunch of stuff, which, remember, since when a human writes it down, it's copyrighted. All that stuff that you're taking, pretty much by definition, there's going to be some exceptions, but pretty much by definition, all that is going to be copyrighted, right? So you've got this big pile of copyrighted stuff, and now you're trying to extract patterns from it. Well, okay, what do we have to do to extract patterns? Step one, literally, we copy it from from a hard drive into RAM. So there's again, a copyright is literally the right to prevent somebody else from copying. So you've got one copy there going from, and now you've got another copy into like your arrays that you're then doing all the magic GPU stuff, right? As you said, Kris, it's just addition, lots of it. And that's another set of copies. And then you're creating this model that is numbers, sort of, right? But the numbers represent some patterns that we learn from this other thing, right? Okay, so one thing that may or may not be true, right? Or a question that we can ask, that first step of copying, where we're doing the training, is that a copyright violation? So that's one question we can ask. Then the model. So the model contains all these numbers, but the numbers represent strings or patterns and imagery, do those represent a copy, right? Or are they some sort of abstract thing? Because if it's a copy, then there's a copyright infringed. But if it's sort of like very abstract, it's not really related to the thing, okay, well then probably not. But that's an intelligible question we can ask. And then finally, we can look at the creation of the output. And we can say like, oh, well, it turns out that the way we created this output, actually everything's like just so weird and out there that it's not a problem. Or like maybe we've trained a model that actually repeats itself an awful lot and, you know, contains things that look an awful lot like some other copyrighted thing. Right. And that, so we can ask at each of those stages, has there been some, there's also, by the way, patents, and we can talk about those a little bit. Separately. But so that's what, you know, we have to ask at each of those stages, right? And who does this, of course, may be separate, right? Like if I am using Copilot, I'm not doing training. So I'm not infringing by training. You know, Microsoft did that, or OpenAI, or however they're. But if I'm outputting code, you know, then there's still that question about the output, right? Like it may be that the first stage is fine, and the output stage is not. I just went through a lot there, so let me pause and like hopefully it's fairly clear. But like I'd love, you know, any questions or thoughts or anything from Slack.
I have like a meta thought, or like because you brought up the whole like we can't copyright numbers thing, which always like reminds me of that. I don't know if it's famous, but the whole Intel thing of like the reason they renamed their line of processors to like Pentium, starting with the 5th generation, because they went to the courts and they were like, we would like to copyright like 586, and the courts were like, no, you can't copyright a number. Or maybe it was with the 486, and then someone tried to knock it off, and then they were like, you can't copyright a number. Sorry, like you can't, or trademark it. Like you can't do things with these numbers.
So you just hit on the thing. This is one of these things where it's all complicated, right? And where it's so actually the question there is trademark, right? So trademark is when you're using some set of numbers or colors, or even there's a few cases now about trademarking smells in commerce, right? You're using it to identify a brand. So like, you know, red shoe soles is a thing. I'm blank. I really want to say Louboutin, but that's not it. It's the red shoe soles is anyway. I
think it is Louis Vuitton.
You know, maybe it's Vuitton. But that's a trademark, right? That is used to identify your product to the public. And so exactly that, Kris, I think it was 386s or 486s, where a court didn't say that it was impossible to trademark a number, but like there's a higher trademarks. The more creative they are, the less skeptical courts are. Is the short and simple version of it, right? And a number obviously not very creative. It's like literally a part number, and you know, whereas Pentium much more creative in that sort of weird sense of it's one word. This is why you get all these weird startups that don't call themselves a name that has anything to do with the thing they're doing, right? Partially because it's more memorable, but partially because the less it sounds like the thing, the easier it is to trademark. But that is a separate, you know, body of law. Like that's interesting. Trademark is the one body of intellectual property law that's very pro the humans at the end of the process. Because the whole thing is that trademarks are supposed to not confuse you. Right. So, in fact, it's companies that bear a lot of the burden there. Sort of the other way around with copyright, right? Where it's supposed to prohibit you from ripping the company off. So, but yeah, there are layers here that are, and again, I mostly haven't touched on patents. I assume that all these AI companies are patenting things out the wazoo, but patents apply to processes, usually not to particular things, right? So you could patent. I'm simplifying a little bit here. There's some exceptions, but you can patent how you do training, right? So like if you created a new way to train a model more efficiently, more effectively, then you can patent that. And if you if you figured out a new way to do outputs from a model, the process of creating those outputs, you could patent. But actually patenting the model itself, with some sort of edge cases, probably not patentable, right? Which gets to one of the recurring themes that we're going to have here, and this gets back to Kris, what you were saying about numbers. Little unclear that the model actually is protectable by anything in modern intellectual property law, right? Like there's actually sort of an open question as to whether or not that thing is something that copyright law can fit into one of its boxes. Because that's the thing, you got to, copyright law has, intellectual property law generally has boxes of things, right? Like patents are for processes that we invented. Well, that's a little bit of a simplification, but for our purposes, that'll do. Copyright is creative works that you created. Trademark is brands that you're using to sell a thing. If it doesn't fit into one of those boxes, and this has actually been a problem with databases, right? So like databases, I mentioned phone books. I think maybe I mentioned this in the last episode too. Under US copyright law, you can't copyright a phone book because the Supreme Court said there's no creativity there, right? The only creativity was you wanted to find the phone number of every person in town. Now, if you said the 100 most popular debutantes in town, right, like which is actually was a thing in New York in the late 1800s, like that list, because it involved creativity and judgment, like that list you could get a copyright on. Now, if somebody else has a list of like my 100 and it's 95 of them are the same, it's going to be hard to protect, but at least in theory, you could protect that thing, right? And so databases, the European Union has a whole separate set of laws just for databases that they call the database right. And so in theory, databases are, in practice, turns out to have been not all that useful, but they invented 20 years ago, 25 years ago, they were like, you know what, we need to encourage more databases. So we're going to create a database right. And so there it is in EU law. It turns out to be mostly unused. So we'll see if with machine learning, maybe some people will say that the models are databases. I think that's going to be a little bit of a hard trick to pull off, but I'd be shocked if somebody doesn't at least try to protect models under European database rights. Which, by the way, I think I touched on this last time around, but copyright law, global platform. And this is one of these where the analogies to programming actually works really well. Essentially, every country on Earth has signed what's called the Berne Convention, which makes copyright, the basic concepts of copyright are more or less the same globally. A lot of implementation details, as with any time you're creating an instance of you're implementing an API, the implementation details matter. But at the high level, copyright is the same globally. The US has no equivalent of the EU database law. The EU is regulating a lot right now on privacy, which bears on training, right? Like, what if you have private information in the model? US federal law says nothing about that. Copyright law says nothing about that. The European Union has very strong opinions on what happens if you accidentally encode private information, especially say like medical information in a model. So there's a whole other field of law. Like, I think one of the cool things about machine learning law, but the very frustrating thing for programmers asking us about opinions, because programmers just want to know, like, is this stuff legal? Can I use it? And the answer is, it depends, because like copyright, patent, trademark, privacy law, database rights, all these things are like, step one is like, well, I don't know, are you in the EU or are you in Japan or are you in the US? Because the answer might be different in all those places. So yeah, I mean, where do we want to, I mean, there's this, we talked a little bit about these sort of big buckets of things, right? One thing that I put in the show notes, and that we just talked a little bit about, like, what analogies do we use? And so maybe it would be helpful, I don't know, but where you all want to go, to talk about some of the analogies that courts have used for this kind of stuff in the past. And
love a good analogy.
So I talked about monkeys. So like one serious analogy that you could make here, right, is that once it's in a model, there's no human involved. And so if you just press the button and say, like, please spit me out some code, there's no copyright, there's no human copyright in that code that's emitted by Copilot. And so therefore you can use it however you please, right? Like that's the most naive, like you hired a monkey to write some code for you. And so we know monkeys can't copyright a selfie. And so this is just like that monkey, right? It's definitely 100% free of copyright. Like that's an analogy that would be nice and simplifying. I don't think it completely works, but it's a good starting point, right? For where, and it's probably closer than, it's a lot closer, I think, than, you know, the flip side of that is I hired a human to write code for me. So if I hire a human to write code for me, there's definitely copyright, right? I definitely have to have a provision in my contract. So like if Copilot were just, you know, going to like an ultra fast typist in Microsoft headquarters, right? That typist, you'd have to have an arrangement with that typist, right? Like I had an old boss who broke both of his wrists in a snowboarding accident. And so he like literally hired an MIT undergrad to be his code typist, right? And for like a month because he couldn't type, and accessibility features, especially on Linux in the early 2000s, were not there. And so he had to have a contract with that person, right? That said, like anything you output is definitely copyright our startup. You don't own anything in it. If you had a monkey in the same situation, you would not have to have a contract. Obviously, you can't sign a contract with a monkey, which is like a good hint. Similarly, you can't sign a contract with Copilot. So like that's one analogy we could look at for the whole system. The problem, of course, is that
sorry.
Oh, yeah. No, go ahead.
Have there been arguments, and I'm sure this is a very obvious argument, but kind of just want to ask it as the silly question. Like Copilot wouldn't exist without a physical human being having been hired by Microsoft to work on that feature and to input and ensure that like the output is XYZ. This is like correct. This is like so I guess like you've got the three parts that you mentioned. You've got obviously training, model, outputs. We've established training as you need somebody to train it and ensure the output is accurate. But I feel like going off the kind of monkey analogy, like that monkey did something that like had they not done it, you would not have the end product. Therefore, in the kind of maybe Copilot analogy, like had that initial engineer not trained effectively, you would not therefore have that. And so could you trace it back? Could an argument be made legally that you can trace that code back to a person who wrote it / also to Microsoft if contractually their code is owned by Microsoft? Like, or is it truly legally in these three buckets? Or really is it? We don't know. An argument could be made.
Yeah. So that's one thing is all of this is TBD. Right?
Okay.
I mean, that there's like a little bit of, courts there is now, since we last talked, there is now a court case about Copilot.
Okay.
I don't want to talk about it too much because it's a little weird in a few ways, or I don't want to over focus on it. But the thing is that this is where it's really important to make sure we've, as you called out correctly, Angela, that there's three different things going on here, right? There's like there's the training, there's the model, and there's the output. So those human employees at Microsoft who did that setup and that initial design of Copilot, that initial training of Copilot, there's probably some rights, or at least arguably, and this is where we get into the question of, well, it's just a pile of numbers, like in the model itself, right? Like if I printed out the model onto sheets of paper and then like photocopy them and start handing them out, like Microsoft having done that creative work to create that model, like they will probably feel entitled, and probably correctly, I mean, though it's a complicated thing, to come after me for printing out the model and but activating the model is arguably a lot more like, I mean, they put a lot of work into creating MS-DOS, right? Or what, Windows 12, is that where we're at now? I've been a Linux and Mac user too long now. They put a lot of work into that, but they don't run around claiming like, well, the operating system helped you invoke VS Code, therefore we have some copyright in the thing. right? Like that, there's sort of a natural barrier there between the creation of the tool and the use of the tool.
I feel like a good analogy here too would be to like a compiler, where it's like, yeah, someone wrote the compiler, but like you input your source code and you get out an artifact that represents that, and it's like the input that went into it is the thing that's copyrightable. And just because people wrote the compiler doesn't give them any permission or copyrights around that, but also doesn't give them like permission for the input of it, right? So they can't say, oh, well, because you ran that copyright material through my compiler, now I have the ability to grant that copyright to you. And it's like, that's not how that works.
So some corrections, because some things were not correctly said. It's a good time for me to remind that I am an OpenAI developer ambassador. So I like to focus on my small little details here. Microsoft is the owner of GitHub. GitHub is using the API of the model that was created by OpenAI, that is called Codex. That is the underlying engine for Copilot. So actually, when you go to VS Code, or when you go to VS Code, and you type something and you have the plugin on for Copilot, what actually happens is that there is a line of code from GitHub, which belongs to Microsoft. I don't know the separation of the entities. You know definitely better, Louis. So they have the API that they're using. That part of the API that they're using is, it has something from me that I wrote, right, in VS Code. It has a part that they added, which is called the prompt, which is something along the lines of, this is what she wrote so far. What do you think she wants to do? Can you complete? So this is their own personal, just GitHub, not OpenAI, not Microsoft. And then this is pinging the endpoint of Codex. That is an engine that belongs to OpenAI, but it runs on the Microsoft Azure cloud. So there's actually all sorts of steps in between to make it even more complicated, but it's not a Microsoft thing.
And the hot rumor is that Microsoft is buying 49% of OpenAI, like sometime this week. So
yes or no, but OpenAI is actually capped profit. So they have an interesting structure that the labs belong to that company that is capped profit. So once they hit the 30x, what happens? The rest of the money goes up to the NGO.
Yeah, there's a whole complicated discussion around, and actually, I mean, one of the things that we have to talk about here is this question that I didn't mean to back into quite yet, but something to signpost for viewers in, oh my goodness, we are flying, is this question of what does it mean to be open in this space, right? Because we don't really know what the rights are, and we don't know what power is in this space. We're learning a lot on the fly, and so you'll see a lot of stuff labeled open in the space. And I don't mean this specific to OpenAI, Natalie, because there's like a lot of folks using open very loosely in this space. Some of your listeners may or may not know the open source initiative for a long time has defined what open source means in software. There's a lot of, again, nuance there, but there is a list of like, these are the open source licenses, and there's a list of criteria. Like open source licenses have to meet certain criteria, amongst others of which is everybody's got to be able to use it for anything, right? You can't slap you can't use this for, nuclear weapons, or you can't use this for human rights violations. If you slap that kind of restriction on it, it's no longer open source as defined by the open source initiative. There's a whole lot of AI stuff that has exactly that kind of language in it. No human rights violation, no harassment, and are calling themselves open anyway. And the gray area there is a really interesting one, and it's one that I've been exploring a lot. I have a newsletter called openml.fyi that hasn't published yet this year, but hopefully this afternoon, and for the first time this year, where I'm exploring exactly these questions of what does it mean to be open and open source, where, Kris, to get back to your example, because I do want a little bit, the compiler, right? We have a very certain assumption. Open source is based on some assumptions of there's source code, there's a compiler, there's an executable, and those assumptions don't hold true in the same way, right? Like there is no source code for a model per se, right? Like there's the data set, there's like the way you trained the data set into the model, but that's not the same as source code from a perspective of, I mean, the data set may be literally too big to download. It may be impossible for you to do on commodity hardware enough training. It may be illegal for you to download because that data set may include private information, contractually restricted information. So what does it mean to be open when you can't reconstruct the whole thing from one end to the other is a really interesting one, and one that I don't think we have a great, I think a lot of the assumptions that the industry has been built on, right? Everybody who uses Go, you know, Kris, to your point about the compiler and about the programming language, I mean, that's the other part of this, right? Like, Kris, if you've got a compiler, you assume that you can just use the outputs of the compiler, right? Well, same thing with the programming language, right? You know, every standard library of every major programming language out there is under a super permissive license, because you do actually, I mean, the one sort of exception to what you're saying, Kris, about like, oh, well, you know, the compiler just spits out a thing at the end, and it's a lot of compilers in a lot of languages, depends on the language, the technology, et cetera, right, will compile in part of the standard library into your executable. And so, in fact, if the standard library has some kind of like use restriction on it, that's a problem. Now, of course, as a practical matter, nobody does that with our languages, because that would be shooting your language in the foot if you had a clause like that, right? So everybody says, yeah, sure, use the standard library however you want. We're not going to like nitpick over that, right? And, you know, we haven't mostly yet reached that point. Like, in some ways, you can think of these restrictions around a lot of these models as sort of equivalent to a standard library in some way, right? Like, it's the developers really want you to live within these platforms, within these frameworks, but unlike the standard library or like the core operating systems, you know, Windows, Linux, Mac, they don't say like, you can't use this for a laundry list of things. Mostly don't say you can't use this for this laundry list of things. That you're a developer, you take for granted that can be done. And right now, a lot of these AI, especially the big platforms, but the models you can download as well, come with a lot of restrictions. An interesting question, and this gets back to this question of, is the model copyrightable or not, is, can we actually make those stick? So like, the way is something we haven't really talked about a little bit, and gets back to this TLDR, right? If I create a binary of a piece of software and you start making copies of it to use it, you need a copyright license from me to do that. So that means I can start sticking conditions in the copyright license, like, you have to pay me every time you do that, or every time you spin up a new instance in the cloud, you've got to pay me for that, or you shouldn't use this for X, Y, and Z bad purposes, or you shouldn't use this to compete with me, right? We put this laundry list of restrictions into binaries. We know as a matter of law that binaries are like executables of traditional software, are copyrightable. We don't actually know for a fact that models are. So when somebody gives you a license, and when somebody gives you a model and says, yeah, and by the way, here's all these restrictions, if you violate these restrictions, I'm going to take away your license to use the model. It's not actually clear that that works, right? It's not actually clear that you need a copyright to use that thing. And if you don't, then how do we enforce these ethical restrictions that the AI industry, for very good reasons, is very concerned about people following, right? Like, Natalie, I don't know I'm curious how you got into the AI space. You know, Kris was saying he wanted to dabble. I had forgotten that you're an ambassador in this space. So you've thought about it a fair bit, right? A lot of the OpenAI model releases, because Natalie didn't say this, but OpenAI has released a lot of different models under a lot of different terms, right? Codex is one of them. There are quite a few others, some under more permissive, some under the more restrictive licenses. And some of those are restricted for very good reasons, like, don't use this to stalk people, don't use this for deepfake porn. But it's unclear how that gets enforced. Like, we don't actually know as lawyers yet how that will work. We've all got theories, but, you know, that would have to be episode 3.
I would love to hear, Natalie, how you got into this space and what your perception here is from the other side, i.e. like as an ambassador. Are there mumblings in the space that you've heard?
I don't understand the question. Can share my thoughts in general,
Like how
but if you're asking something
like
specific,
you got into this space as an ambassador, as someone who works in, you know, open AI. When you're thinking about,
I don't
like,
work in OpenAI.
what as an ambassador then, who has interacted with OpenAI and knows some stuff about it, I would love to hear either yourself or people you've chatted to in that space more directly, how they're thinking about like open sourcing, giving out models for use, whether, as Louis, you mentioned, with parameters around like don't use it for this, or like, hey, you can use this for whatever use case you need it to. Like, do you have you heard of any opinions on, or do you have any information on how they make those decisions? The answer can be no. I think that's just a really interesting, like, I'd love to be in the room when they're thinking about like, oh, we've got this new cool model. Should we put some restraints on it? Should we give any like PSA, don't use this for XYZ?
Yes, that's many questions, definitely. So what I do there is I volunteer there, you can say. I'm a developer ambassador, which means that people who get access to that, it was more relevant to the time that it was rolling access to that, to GPT-3 and then to DALL-E and so on. Then people would come to my office hours and just ask me questions, mostly technical questions, but sometimes also, can I do that? Or think about things with me. So I mostly interact with the users. So there's all sorts of restrictions on place. For example, when DALL-E just started being public, you could not put all sorts of words in there. And then came the other side of this entire thing when Midjourney came out, and then you could write anything, and then it obviously ended up in weird parts of the internet, as it tends to be when you have free access to everything. So I think this is kind of two edges to that, and the balance will be somewhere in between. One way of enforcing now good usage, it's a very wide definition, is that you always have to go through a review before you if you use OpenAI in production. So if you use it for fun, use it for fun. If you want to actually use that, you have to get really like a PR as we know it from our world of context, but actually somebody from OpenAI will go through your plan of what are you going to do with that in production, how is it going to be reasonably safe, and so on. So this is how it's happening right now. How will it be in the future? That's a great question. Another interesting question of what is now versus what is later is something that has been surfacing on, Hacker News, Reddit, and so on. So there's a professor that is called Scott Aronson, I want to say. He came to OpenAI for a year of research. So he's now in the middle of it. And he's driving the concept or the idea of watermarking output of text. We know watermark from images. If you go to stock images, you pay money and then you don't get that watermark. And then they have the idea of, or some people in the team have the idea of doing that for text. And there's discussion, yes or no, good or bad, and so on. And it's also interesting to do that for code, but it's a lot harder.
Yeah, and I think this is where one of the things that I'm super interested in, openness, in, right? Like original open source, it was in some sense just an IP law thing, right? Like it was just a copyright license, but it redistributed power in the industry, right? It made it possible for a small startup like Google, because their original plans were like, well, we're going to need, in order to do this, we're going to need tens of thousands of machines. Of course, now it's tens of millions or whatever, right? But at the time, the idea that you could license 10,000 machine like operating systems, again to this question of copyright licensing, from at the time your options were Sun or Microsoft, right? That would have been implausible, right? It just would have been too costly to create Google. And open source allowed new competitors to come in. And we've seen this in a variety of different spaces, right? It tends to, I won't say it ends control, because obviously we've ended up in a world where there's a small number, again, of controlling. They're just using different tools to control the industry. So where are we going to be at that? Because there's, Natalie mentioned Codex. There's a project called Big Code, which is an open-ish. You can join the Slack, you can download the models, you can discuss their ethical restrictions, and that is all being done in the open, right? It's not inside any one company. There are some corporate sponsors to buy GPU time, but it is going to be a research-oriented alternative to Codex. But if that's if that's out there in the open, or what I've been calling open-ish in my newsletter, because it's open with some restrictions. Are they huge restrictions, small restrictions? We don't really know yet. OpenAI is going to be doing this very good, I think, very interesting work on things like fingerprinting. Like you say, if you want to deploy in production, OpenAI is going to challenge you on the safety of your usage. Okay, well, but once it's out there, if somebody else is doing an open-ish competitor, what's the infrastructure for, and this gets again to these other layers. I think if your listeners take away any one thing from this talk, right, it's that for a long time we used intellectual property licenses to govern the ethics of our software. That was weird and probably not very good, and we should stop doing that as the first line of defense, right? Because there's too many other tools of government regulation. Natalie's example of a platform regulating what's being used, codes of conduct, this 25-year period where intellectual property was the hook that we did all of our ethical regulation through was a very weird period. And it was very lucrative for me as an intellectual property lawyer, but probably not the right thing for the industry, right? So again, for your listeners, if there's any one thing to take away from this, it's that if somebody says, hey, we should use an IP license to make human beings behave better, your instinctive reaction should not be, oh, hey, that's what the free software people did. Your instinctive reaction should be, oh, if that's the only tool we've got, then yeah, maybe. But it's almost never the only tool we've got. There's so many other layers of regulation now that we can use to try to govern how we work together that are probably better suited for it. Because IP is just, like I said, to get back to this, we don't even know, right? And we haven't even gotten into some of the weird side corners. I don't know how much time we've got left, but yeah.
So I've been thinking about something, and it's related to this whole Copilot, or really any model that writes code for you. And it feels like there's kind of this spectrum of things when it comes to writing code, where it's fundamentally all of us write code based on code that we've seen before. But we learn the code, learn the syntax, learn algorithms, learn all of that, and then we can use our own creative ability to write something. And then there's kind of the other end of it, where you can just copy and paste something else that you found and go use that. And the thing I've been thinking about is where is the line in that gray space when it tips to one side or the other, right? If I copy the whole thing and then modify it a bunch, is that how much does that amount to okay, this is the new derivative thing that doesn't have the old copyright thing? Because once again, you're reading code, you're absorbing code from tons of other different places. Our minds are doing the things that the models do at the end of the day. Our brain is a model in and of itself. So it's we're producing stuff that would be said, okay, this is your copyright because you wrote it, but it's based on everybody else's work. So where's where does that derivative line exist, and what actions are required to make it happen? Because obviously, if I copy and paste some code from one place to another place, I don't get the copyright to that code because I've just copied it, right? And then create a new derivative work. But if I retype all of that code and change some things along as I'm retyping it, is that still a derivative work? If I'm not looking at it, does that make it less of a derivative work than if I am looking at it? It feels like this whole space is super murky, and I feel like the answer is we haven't really found an answer to any of this. But
so one, absolutely correct. We haven't found an answer, or we've sort of found several answers, and none of them are great, right? Because it's going to depend on things like, well, so one analogy, we sort of got off the analogies track, but one analogy here is Google Book Search, where they said up front, we are copying all the world's books. But we did a lot on the backside, right, on the user interface to make it really hard for people to get more than a fraction of the book out at any one time, right? And we created a whole lot of new value by making all these books searchable. So a court looked at that and was like, well, yeah, all that copying, very bad, but all the value that was created and the reasonable steps taken to protect it means that it's what lawyers literally call a balancing test, right? The court was sort of like, so that's one analogy, right? And in that case, as long as the Copilot folks are taking like good faith steps, Copilot at least is going to be protected. Maybe if you're copying a section of a book out of Google Book Search or a copy of code out of Copilot, you might be in trouble. But Microsoft and OpenAI will probably be okay, right? Because it might be like Google Book Search to a court. But there's a case in front of the Supreme Court right now about Andy Warhol, and there's some cases in California, but federal courts about the song Blurred Lines, and where like only a handful of notes in the Blurred Lines case was enough to make that song a copyright infringement. Now, a lot of IP attorneys are like horrified by that outcome because it's like so small. And to a certain extent, the judge was like, you know what, it just has the same vibe. And IP lawyers are like, but you can't copyright vibe. And the judge was like, yeah, I can. Watch me do it. And, we don't know like where. So code, by the way, Copilot is the easy case, right? Because there's not much vibe in code. But like as soon as we start getting into like DALL-E that Natalie already mentioned, Midjourney, all these things, like, okay, well then we get into like, and this is where the Warhol thing, the Warhol case comes in, like there's that Warhol-y vibe, like, is that protectable? Is that like, and I should say the Warhol case is not about Warhol's vibe. Warhol in this case is the copier, not the person being copied. But the same kinds of questions like are just going to keep popping up, and we don't know yet where these lines are going to be. And again, the outcomes are going to be different for the company that makes the model and the person who uses the model. So the one thing that I've told people consistently is I think that GitHub is probably actually safe here, right? Like I don't think running Copilot is itself an infringement. I think it's a lot like Google Book Search. Using Copilot 99% of the time is going to be fine. But if you're doing something like clean rooming somebody's API, imagine like if you tell Copilot like, hey, I've got this API that happens to be somebody else's API. And by the way, that company might be using GitHub behind the scenes. We don't even know. And it starts re-implementing their entire API for you. Like that's where, again, the vibes, the balancing might be a lot different, right? And we don't know yet. Like that's where it's funny. I was having a conversation with a friend who I assumed his company was doing no clean rooming, and I was like, oh yeah, well the only thing is like as long as you're not clean rooming, and he like literally picks up his phone and texts his head of his CTO, and it's like we need to talk tomorrow morning because it turns out this friend's company was doing some clean rooming of something with a company that hates them on the other side of it. Right. So like that's where you get into that's the other thing, right? Like a lot of these things are hypothetical because nobody's gonna know or care 95% of the time. But I would definitely not use Copilot to re-implement any Oracle APIs. That's my one other piece of advice to you that you should remember from this podcast.
Oracle is like the litigious people that do lead us forward in some ways. Like their fun poem in their their connection protocol, so you can't implement it without copyright infringement. They have all the creative stuff.
They kept me very employed for a long time on the Google Oracle case. I worked for Google, to be clear. The Oracle people can go rot in the swamp as far as I'm concerned. But
and for
is that my unpopular opinion, or does that count as a popular opinion?
I guess it depends on who you are. And for our listeners, can you just define what clean rooming is? Because some people might not be familiar with that term.
Yeah, sure. So there are times when you might want to copy what another company is doing, right? And so clean rooming is the idea. It comes originally from patent law, because you don't want to copy somebody else's. You might want to get to the same result, but get there in a different way. So, somebody will write out, here's the result we want to get. You're not allowed to look at anything the other company did. And so that's what, when IBM re-implemented Java way back in the day, they gave instructions to people like, well, here's the API headers, the Java API headers. You can't look at anything. You have to promise up and down, I haven't looked at anything that Oracle's ever done. I haven't. And that was a clean room because it was clean of anything that Oracle had done. If you did the same thing today and somebody used Copilot, like, you yourself might be clean of anything that Oracle had done, but we don't know if Copilot is clean of anything. But we are now 8 minutes past where Angelica was saying frantically in chat, we gotta stop. So let's stop.
It's so
Thank you all
hard
for
to
having
cut
me.
off such wonderful conversation. I always struggle. I'm like, this is the last thought. Oh, but this is really interesting. Let's let this go on longer.
Sounds like we need a part 3.
I know. That's what I was just thinking. I was like, we're going to do a part 3. We may well need one. But
maybe I'll finally restart my own podcast and bring you all for a crossover. So.
maybe. Awesome. Well, we're going to now dive into unpopular opinions, which I'm very excited about. So get them ready, get your brain cogs going if you haven't got one. And here we go.
Unpopular opinion. I actually think you should probably leave. Unpopular opinion.
So, what is your unpopular opinion? Lewis, over to you.
Super hot take. Blockchain was good because it took everybody's attention away from ML for several years so that people could actually get some stuff done before the buckets of money sloshed in. And now that people have realized that blockchain is actually all terrible, the buckets of money are sloshing into ML, and that's good and bad, right? It can be, it's great in some ways, but it can be distracting in others. So I'm sort of actually glad that blockchain took that energy for a few years.
Responses? Do we think that's popular, unpopular?
I mean, I hesitate with anything that's like blockchain is good, but
I told you it was a good hot take.
I mean, in general, it feels like that's we were able to go do some good stuff because we kept the boatloads of money and all the bad stuff that comes with it away from this space for a bit. I can get on board with that. Yeah, the blockchain and crypto in general, though, I'm just kind of like,
Let me mint that.
Yeah. I mean, I've been watching some CoffeeZilla on YouTube recently because he's like this investigator that goes into all of these different types of scams, and I'm just like, it is so easy to just create a new coin and then just extract money from people, and I'm like, this is a wild space. All started because of this blockchain thing, but then again, most of finance also, we've had Ponzi schemes for a very long time. So
okay, we'll see what the Twitter public think. Kris, do you have an unpopular opinion?
I don't think I do. I mean, I'm sure I have many unpopular opinions. I don't have one
at this
prepared.
exact moment. Okay.
Yeah. I guess my unpopular opinion would be New Year's resolutions suck, and you should just try. Who's it? CGP Grey has some good videos on theme. Have themes. Have a theme for the season of I will. This is the season of learning or whatever. Those are much better than I'll go to the gym 5 days a week or things like that.
Yeah.
Build some good flexibility into them. But I don't think that, New Year's resolutions suck is a unpopular opinion. I think a lot of people hold that opinion.
I was going to ask if you had an unpopular resolution, like I'm going to steal candy from a baby once a week or something like that.
I do think I have one of my resolutions is like crazy, but it's not crazy because like I can do it, but like I'm trying to like write more. Like I recently did a review of how much journaling I've done, and over the past 2 years actually, coming up in the anniversary when I started journaling like heavily, I think I'm approaching about 3.6 million words written over the course of 2 years. So one of my resolutions is to write more. So yeah. I think that would be unpopular with many people because that sounds insane. Of like,
Best of luck.
you write millions of words per year. Yes, I write millions of words.
Yeah, that's 5,000 words a day, man.
Yes.
Well done. Okay. I think that might be an unpopular resolution. I will not be taking on writing more than 5,000 words a day.
I mean, it only interestingly, it only takes me about an hour to do. So it's not like it's.
Now you're just showing off, Kris. I write really slowly, okay? You put me to shame. I maybe write like 5 words a minute.
This is what happens when you're a writer. You just, the brain is brimming with things that need to get out of it. You can make space for the other things.
Well, I look forward to reading your encyclopedia length journal next week. Natalie, unpopular resolution or opinion?
My unpopular resolution / opinion, I guess you can make them into one. I've been trying to eat seasonal, and it's terrible in winter, at least here in the north / central part of Europe. Like all the fruits you get, if you try to eat fruits and veggies, mostly you get apples and roots. So my unpopular resolution will be to eat slightly less seasonal, and my unpopular opinion is that we should make seasonal food better or different.
Okay. And that was me thinking you just were drinking an obscene amount of pumpkin spice lattes.
Pumpkins, yeah. Pumpkins show up on time. You can use spice latte on them if you grill them. But no, I just mean like produce.
Yeah. Okay. So eat less seasonally. Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Well, it's been an absolute
now
pleasure.
tomorrow I'm gonna see like tomatoes on the house or something.
What is your Oh, sorry.
What is mine?
What is your unpopular opinion, Angelica?
Yes.
Oh, whatever I hate to get out of it. My unpopular opinion / view is, let's think. I've got one, but I don't know. I think it would actually be unpopular, and I think I'd get some slack for saying it, but it's actually what I think right now is sometimes it is okay to not do your own construction work and just make someone else do it for you. Context being, I've tried to put a picture up yesterday because I was like, no, I can do it myself. I can hang up this picture. I did. And then it fell down and smashed all over my floor about a day later, after I had spent about half an hour getting quite irate at a friend who said that he would just come help me because he didn't think I could do it. And I was really trying to prove myself. And then I called him and I was like, it fell. So
did you use some light or did you just like pick a hammer?
My unpopular opinion is sometimes it's okay to admit you can't do the thing that you spent half an hour being very offended because someone thought you couldn't.
That pride sometimes gets you.
And then I have to buy a whole new frame. It like smashed everywhere. It was a whole thing. And I have a hole in my wall now. But anyway. So that is my unpopular opinion.
I mean, it's unpopular with me. Those posters back there, those bookshelves, I put all those up myself.
Kris, this is like Kris can do everything show-off show today. What's up? Okay, maybe you should help me, Kris.
I mean, I could have, but your friend could also help you. Like, it's.
No, I might be hitting you up after this. But on that positive,
Someone else can do it for me is the basis of open source. So, like, I think it's okay.
Can trust you to bring it all together for us, Louis. Thank you so much. We'll have a wonderful rest of your days. Thank you, listeners. And that's it, unfortunately. Bye.